I hate it, but I believe it is true of human nature that we like to feel superior. We like to feel superior to other people, to the point that we actually, if you give us a chance, will enjoy making fun of someone else. One evening in a small town, a truck driver pulled in. He was very tired, and he pulled into this little truck stop to get him something to eat. It was an 18-wheeler, and he went into the coffee shop, and then he ordered a hamburger with all the stuff that goes along with that, a piece of pie, a cup of coffee. And after he'd been sitting there and started to eat, 3 burly bikers walked into the shop. And they started harassing the waitress. And then they noticed the tired truck driver over there, and they went over and began to harass him. They tipped his plate off the table onto his lap. They took his coffee cup and began to drink it. They took his pie and threw it on the floor. He said nothing. He got up quietly and went and paid his check, and then walked out. And one of the big burly motorcycle guys said, well, he didn't do or say anything. He wasn't too much of a man. And as he said that, there was a customer coming in the door at that exact moment, listening to him say that he wasn't much of a man. And the customer said, well, yeah, he must not be much of a truck driver either, because on his way out, he ran over 3 motorcycles and never even stopped. You see, what is it that we're laughing at, It's funny. In a board meeting for a small mountain church, a deacon said, preacher, I think we need a chandelier in this church. And another deacon said, I'm not for it at all. The preacher said, well, why don't you think we need a chandelier in this church? And the deacon said, well, first, nobody in this church can spell it. Second, nobody in this church can play it. And third, what this church needs above anything else is more light. But it had to be that small mountain church. Often man has a favorite group. And therefore, we call it birds of a feather flock together. Because of that, the group that you hang with, we tend to want to put down the group we don't hang with to feel better about who we are. I guess that's what it is. I mean, for example, could I talk about the Gators and the Knowles for a moment? Could I talk about Gators in Tennessee? There's great respect between the two. I could talk about Alabama and everybody else, but I won't do that. If I got on to race, this is the truth. White folks have been prejudiced against and put down black folks. But it's also true that black folks have also been prejudiced against and put down white folks. There may be good reasons for all of that from some perspective, but it still happens. And it's a human thing. It's not a good thing. Prejudice, believe it or not, is not an American phenomenon. We live kind of in a bubble. I don't know if you know this, but having lived outside the country, you realize that Americans think the only thing that's happening is what's happening in America. And y'all don't actually even hardly watch the news outside this country. There's 188 countries in the world. There's a lot of things going on in the world than just what's happening in our political system and what's happening here. But we tend to think that the only place prejudice exists is here in America. Now, that's not the case. There's plenty of prejudice go around in America, but let me give you just a glimpse into this, okay? So you know that it is a worldwide problem. The Bukara, or the Buraku, and the Burakim of Japan, they were the people who were leather workers, executioners, undertakers, butchers, and sewage removal. They are made up the lowest class in a feudal system in Japan, And to this day, though you cannot look at and tell any difference in the way someone is dressed or looks, they are still known. Employees of companies going back from generations refuse to employ them. They filter them out literally through fancy computer programs, and if they do happen to hire them, they do it to leverage pay at less or to restrict their career. And you may not know this, but there is such an anti-burakuman graffiti thing that goes on. It goes on the internet, but it also goes on walls. And so the average Japanese individual, even though this only makes a very small percentage of their population, less than 3%, it is common for them to call them four-legs animals by the average Japanese. And you thought Japanese, how can you tell them apart, right? Japanese, you can't tell these apart. But they know, and they do this. If you go in the United States, and we get past black and white, we can talk about colorism. Something we don't talk about very much in the United States of America, but there's a preference for skin lightness or darkness. And if your skin's lighter, that's considered preferable. I don't know why, but that is the case. But now that's not just in America. If you go to India, there's colorism in India. The darker skinned individual in India is treated as inferior. So we're out of India, we're in Japan, we're in the United States. But more than that, you go to South Korea. In South Korea, the North Koreans are treated badly. And you would think that would be the case, but first of all, they come there often with physical or mental scars, and it's difficult to make the transition from the slow-paced life to a fast-paced life in the South. But their problem is they don't bring the skills. They can't speak English, which most South Koreans need to be able to do in business. They can't operate computers, and there's a great deal of mistrust to the point that they're suspected as being spies, and they won't hardly hire them in any kind of government position because of that. Then if you go to North Korea, so you think, well, South Korea's got this problem of prejudice, but then you go to North Korea and there's a thing called Songbun. And Songbun is, you'd think in a communistic country there wouldn't be any inequality, but there is. There's an active caste system in North Korea, in a communist country. Actions and status of their ancestors of the Songbun come into play, where a person can live, where a person can have a job, his education, how much education he can receive. There's actually 5 estates of this caste system. They are called special, nucleus, basic, complex, hostile. And if you're in any of those, you run with the crowd you're in. If we go to Great Britain, how could there be any kind of prejudice in Great Britain? But Great Britain has long been known. If y'all watch movies, you know this is the case. There is an upper, a middle, and a working class, and they do not mix, and they make fun of each other on a regular basis. It is a part of their system. If you go to Nigeria, there is the Ashu of the Igboland. The Ashu of the Igboland, the Igbo people are in the southeast or south central of Nigeria in a place called Igboland. And they still hold to much of their ancient beliefs. And they believe in Earth Mother and Creator God. But the Oshu are what's known as the untouchables. The Oshu were the people that were sacrificed to the gods. Now, we don't know if they actually literally sacrificed them to God, but it sounds like it, because that's the name they give them. And they were the lowest case, and they were considered slaves. The rest of the country made slaves the Oshu. And they were treated abominably and dehumanized in every case. And so the upper case, which is now the Dala class will not hardly have anything to do with the Ashu, and they dominate them completely, and they refuse to marry in them, even though it's legal and all that, but they refuse to do it lest they be dehumanized. Let's come back to the United States. You thought it was all about black and white. Let's talk about something else. Donald, you'll appreciate this. How about the Appalachians in the United States of America? Making fun of people from the Appalachians. We assume that if you're from the Appalachians or West Virginia or thereabouts, you know what I'm talking about? That you are ignorant, you're backward, and you probably are related to your mother in another way than she's your mother. I mean, it's just incest is something that's a joke about. We make a big joke about it. Negative stereotypes in the media go without challenge. Now, if you make fun of anybody else in the media today on TV, you will be rebuked. But you can make fun of a redneck anytime you want in the United States of America. You can call them hillbillies, backward, whatever. That's okay, because that's okay. But it isn't okay. If you go to Latvia, let's talk about another country over in Europe. Latvia, as you know, won its independence from the Soviet Union in 1990. In 1919, they had a law called the citizenship law. When they got Russia out and all those citizens, they brought that law back in. There were 730,000 non-citizens who had migrated or immigrated from Soviet Union into Latvia during the Soviet Union period. Well, you can't vote if you're not among the citizens, and they didn't qualify. You couldn't work for the civil service if you weren't a citizen. And so right now, that number has already dropped to 280,000. They're tired of being treated as a non-citizen. And it was enforced pretty heavily. But let's go to Israel. Okay, Israel, they're all Jews. Everybody's a Jew's a Jew, right? Everybody's treated the same. Not so much. The inter-Jew discrimination in Israel is terrible. We're not talking about the Palestinians now. I know you know that issue, right? Everybody knows that issue. Do you know that the Jews don't like the Jews? And I'm talking about the dedicated Jews now. We're not talking about, see, this isn't something we get to talk about a whole lot, but it's really bad. There was, in 1950, Israel passed the law of return, so you had the right to immigrate and receive citizenship. You got benefits of housing, Hebrew language studies, you got full tuition for a degree. So those are great benefits, but then it was who decides who counts as a Jew. There's two different classes, and I can't pronounce this because I can't speak Hebrew, but I'll try. Ashkenazi, the Ashkenazi group, are the larger group that came from Europe, and they are considered the superior group. And they discriminate against the Jews of any other background. The primary other group is called the Mizrahi, or the Mizrahi Jews, who are from the Middle East. There's the Sephardic Jews from Spain and North Africa, and the African Jews. All of them, by the Ashkenazim, because the Ashkenazim feel superior, they're all treated as maybe not even Jews. So you don't get the benefits that the others get. What a world we live in. Do you see what I'm saying? Everybody's looking for an angle. Similarly, and the reason I bring all that up is not to talk about that, but to talk about something else. Similarly, there was a hatred between Jews and Samaritans in Jesus' time. And I'm not talking about a mild hatred. And it wasn't just the Jews against the Samaritans. It was both directions. Okay, boy, that got loud. Sorry. The Samaritans were literally hostile toward the Jews. They taunted the Jews and they said that they rejected the Old Testament. Majority of the Jewish Old Testament, the writings, that's the Psalms and the Proverbs and stuff like that, and the prophets. They didn't receive any of those. So they kind of got along, if you will, theologically with the Sadducees. They claimed to have another copy of the law that they said was superior to the Jews. They also claimed that they observed the law better than the Jews observed it. So they looked down upon the Jews. Well, the Jews just returned the favor. The Jews literally were hostile toward the Samaritans. How bad was it? They would not touch anything of Samaria if they could keep from it. To just touch something that a Samaritan had touched would make them contaminated. So serious was it that most of the time when they were traveling from north to south, they would cross the Jordan River twice to keep from going through Samaria, to keep from touching anything. In John 4 and verse 9, we'll read this in a moment, the Jews, it says, have no dealings with the Samaritans. There's another way to translate that. The NIV translates it this way. They do not associate with. The word associate literally means to share the use of. They would not share the use of anything. If one touched it, don't touch the other. A utensil, a fork, a knife, a plate, anything like that, you would not. The Jews will not use the same dishes that a Samaritan would use, and the Samaritans were considered permanently unclean. They condemned the Samaritans for the history of what they called their defective faith, and their faith was defective. That's true. They also condemned the Samaritans for their pagan ancestry from the Assyrians. That's true too. They publicly denounced the Samaritans and their copy of the law as absolutely not inspired and not from God. They denied that the Samaritans had any Jewish lineage whatsoever. John 4 and verse 12. They publicly cursed Samaritans in their synagogues. They had sermons that would pronounce a curse upon the Samaritans regularly. It wasn't unusual at all. And they refused Samaritans to serve as a witness in a Jewish court. Even if he's the only guy that saw it, they wouldn't bring him in to be a witness. They refused Samaritans to become a proselyte to Judaism. Anybody could become a proselyte to Judaism, but not a Samaritan. He can never, because they went on to believe, and they preached that Samaritans were excluded from the afterlife. There is no hope of them. They cannot be saved no matter what they do. Wow. So often, a good guy turns out to be a surprise, as he was thought to be a bad guy. I mean, you do this with cartoons, Batman, Spider-Man, or in a movie, Iceman, which I thought in Top Gun was the better of the pilots, but that's a whole other story. I thought he did a better job acting too. How about Jesus? They killed him, and he turns out to be the best man. That's the point I want to make tonight. And I know I've gone a long way around to get to this idea, and that is, among the evil Samaritans, we find 4 good Samaritans. There's so many assumptions about people groups that maybe we need to hear this from a different perspective. So I want to do that. First, there's the helpful Samaritan. If you're in Luke 10, which was read to you earlier, I'll just focus on a little bit. I encourage you to read it again. Just verse 33. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. Well, I will 36 and 37. So, which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said, he who showed mercy or had compassion upon him. And then he says, go and do likewise. Isn't it interesting that Jesus used a Samaritan? And then he says he's like the helpful guy. Interesting. We'll come back to that idea. Second thing, there's the thankful Samaritan. Go to Luke 17. I'll just briefly read a few things here. Verse 11 is when it begins. Now it happened, he went to Jerusalem, and he's passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. So these are Samaritans he's dealing with. Then he entered a village, and there met him 10 men who were lepers. Drop down to verse 15. And one of them, now he healed all of them, and one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned, and with a loud voice glorified God, and fell down on his face at his feet, giving him thanks, and he was a Samaritan. And you don't think about it, but a lot of times some of the attitudes that we have for a group that's not a part of your group is that my group would always have the best attitude. Not so much. That's the point Jesus is making. Not so much. The better group, the more thankful group in this situation was the one that everybody looked down on. Man, that interesting. Isn't that a message to us all? Number 3. You'll notice I'm moving faster now, so it should be relieved a little bit. The remorseful Samaritan. Look at John 4. We won't read all of this. John 4 is a great text, verses 7 through 29. It begins in verse 7, if you're in John chapter 4. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. She was a Samaritan. And Jesus said to her, give me a drink. Now that was a shocker, based upon what I just said, right? You should know that. Verse 9 says, then the woman of Samaria said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealing with Samaritans. It's worse than that. Jews didn't have any dealings with women. I mean, even if you know Orthodox Judaism, they won't hardly sit next to each other. They won't hardly talk to each other. Men talk to men, women talk to women. Of course, it's sometimes that way at your house. And if you have a group over, the men end up one place and the women are in the kitchen, that kind of thing. But they don't have anything to do with each other. It says, verse 10, Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Now that's interesting. If you'd have said that, you'd have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Isn't he offering salvation to a Samaritan, one that can't be saved? It's interesting, isn't it? Drop down to verse 17. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and one whom you now have is not your husband. She's shacking up, I guess. In that you spoke truly. The woman said to him, sure, sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. That's a good guess. Drop down to verse 25. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And he'd obviously proved it by that point. She didn't have any doubt about it. Drop down to verse 28. The woman then left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, come see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Now here's the significance. She could not say that. Never thought about this. She could not say that unless she admitted what he had told her. So she had to admit this about her marriage situation and what she had done with her life. Otherwise, there's no telling here. She hadn't told him anything. Because if I just tell you, well, he told me everything. Well, what did he tell you? That's the first question going to come to your mind. Well, what did you say? What did he know? So she had to admit her lifestyle. That means to me that not only was she thrilled to find the Messiah and that there was hope for her salvation from the Messiah's point of view, but that she had been repentant of her life. Now, here's the thing. It's amazing sometimes. You think sometimes only the ones you run with are the ones that are really sincere. Y'all know where that might fit? I might not should go there. Let me go to number 4. The truthful Samaritan. Go to John chapter 8, verses 37 through 48. You'd be surprised who this Samaritan is. Verse 37. I know that you are Abraham's descendants. You'll notice that this is red letter here. But you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. Drop down to verse 40. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. Some folks just don't like to hear the truth. Verse 43, why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. Interesting. Verse 44, you are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe? Verse 48. Then the Jews answered and said to him, did we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Well, I guess he just bragged on them too many times. He just bragged on them too many times. You just must be a Samaritan. I'd say that was a good Samaritan. By the way, you know, there is such a thing as being truthful. Amen? And I don't know if you're not doing the right thing, truth kind of hurts. If your heart's not right, it just hurts. And it's not considered positive, it's considered negative. So those are the 4 that are called Samaritans in your New Testament. They're helpful, they're thankful, remorseful, truthful. Now, who would have thought that the group that were looked down upon turns out to be such good folks? Let me read this to you. I know it's a little long, but I think it's worth it. It's something I read this week. It's a blog. I don't like thinking about this incident. My dad worked at a beachside bar and grill when I was little. In addition to being a chef, he ran and DJ'd the bike and car shows for the restaurant. The car shows were usually on Wednesdays and the bike nights were on Friday. A small detail, but important to the story, The car shows were on a school night, so I was rarely able to go, but my father would often bring me to the bike nights. By all accounts, I was an adorable and pretty mellow kid, and the bikers absolutely loved me. And yes, you might say that this was no environment for a little girl. But I learned a lot about loyalty and friendships from being around bikers. My dad told me that some of them would call into the restaurant just to ask if I would be there that week. And they'd often bring me stuffed animals and candy. My favorite of the bikers was a man that I affectionately called Uncle Teddy. He was a friend of my parents and an absolute mountain of a man, around 6'8", 400 pounds easily. He was an ex-Marine who loved his Harley and his cigars, and every week for 5 years he would bring me a Butterfinger and a Beanie Baby. I was 6 years old the night it happened, 2003. My father had brought me to the bike show as he normally did, but I couldn't keep my eyes open past 8 p.m. The show didn't end until 10, so my dad had gotten into the habit of putting an air mattress in the back of the restaurant, and he and Teddy would check on me every 15 minutes. I was asleep when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was a man I'd seen around before, and he wasn't dressed in his biker gear. He was wearing a short-sleeved plaid shirt and jeans and looked greasy, but not particularly scary. He smiled at me and told me that his name was Sean, that he was a friend of my dad's, and that my dad had asked him to drive me home. My parents had tried to ingrain stranger danger in me, and they told me 1,000 times to never talk to anyone I didn't know, but he knew mine and my dad's name as well as the nickname everyone called me. I totally bought it. I got up, grabbed the flamingo beanie baby Uncle Teddy had given me, and started to walk towards the parking lot. Sean didn't have a bike. He had a very old 4-door sedan. He opened the back door for me, and I climbed inside. You know how in senior citizens' home they often have plastic wrapped couches or chairs? No demeaning there, by the way. That's what the back seat of this car was like, totally covered in plastic. I didn't think that it was probably so that there would be no trace of DNA left behind. Sean started to drive away, and to this day, I can't believe how lucky I got. He had parked the car behind the restaurant in a way that it wasn't immediately visible to the bike show. But as we pulled away, I saw Teddy headed through the door, presumably to check on me. He just happened to look up at that exact moment, probably to acknowledge the car, and I smiled at him. Uncle Teddy didn't waste a moment. Didn't even stop to tell my dad what he was going on. He got on his bike and was on that car. Before we'd even totally cleared the avenue that led out of the parking lot, the avenue that you had to take to get to the restaurant was long, about 1.5 miles, and then you had to go down another long road before you make it to the highway. Sean saw Teddy approaching in his rear view and attempted to speed up, but he must have realized it was futile. He had been seen, and Teddy had his license plate number and a good description. Sean stopped the car, turned around, and told me very calmly to get out of the car. I was scared by this point, and I didn't waste a moment climbing out and running to Teddy. Sean burnt rubber driving away, and Teddy held me for a moment before putting me on the back of his bike and taking me back to my dad. By the time we got back, cops had been called, and they were surrounding the place. A lot of the show had emptied out, and my dad was sobbing and screaming on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. I'll never forget that moment. I ran up to him, hugged him as tightly as I could, and then the rest is all a blur. I talked to cops, I talked to my dad, I even went down to the station and spoke to a sketch artist. I didn't get home until around 2 a.m. Teddy never left my side. And APB was put out on the vehicle, which had been reported as stolen. The sketch circulated around the local news stations, but it didn't turn up anything concrete. At one point, I was asked to look at a lineup, but none of them were him. Fast forward about 8 years. I was 14, and my dad decided I was old enough to know what happened. Sean had been spotted lurking around the bike show a few times before that night and was a customer at the restaurant fairly regularly. He knew my nickname because he had been watching me for over a month. He knew my schedule and consequently how often Teddy and my dad checked on me. When his evil plan was botched and Teddy brought me back to the show, everyone had left. I'd assumed it was because the police had been investigating a crime scene, but I was wrong. They were all out looking for Sean. Teddy told them the make and the model of the car with the description of Sean. And one of the guys thought that he sounded like a guy that frequented one of the biker bars downtown. I remember my dad pausing for a long time. And I asked him what happened after that. He said, they found him. It's funny how you can decide a man's bad, isn't it? It's funny how you can pick and choose the people and decide who's good and who's bad when you don't even know them. Interesting. Another story, quickly. Schoolhouse. I'll never forget my first day. I was supervising teacher was watching on. I was really nervous. It's third graders. I told them to take out their crayons for the next daily assignment. All of them obeyed except one. A girl with 2 long, dark braids called herself Estrella, or Little Star. I said, "Why are you unprepared for class?" I demanded, and she said, "Well, my sister has my crayons." She said, "You should each have your own crayons," I told her. "That's no excuse." Then she said, there are 10 children in my family. Her big brown eyes never left me. And she said, "We have to take turns." I was taken aback, completely misjudged the situation. All day, Estrella's words played on my mind. The next morning, I bought a pack of crayons to leave on Estrella's desk. She was so happy. That experience taught me an important lesson. Every student has a unique set of challenges. It was my mission to help my students overcome them. That mission energized me. But wait, not the end of the story. Recess was almost over. Stella turned to me and started chatting. "How long have you been teaching?" she asked. I told her, "Well, I started about 20 years ago in Ramona Elementary." "Well, I went to school there 20 years ago," Stella said. And I looked at her again, this time really seeing her. Those big brown eyes, that long dark hair. "Did you used to have 2 long braids?" I said. "And we called you Estrella?" Or Stella gasped. He said, You gave me the crayons." She'd become a teacher to help students like I'd helped her. Even doing something that small, it mattered. That summer, I threw myself into teaching with a renewed sense of purpose. Estrella had taught me a lesson once again. Whether it's the bikers, or it's a kid without crayons, or it's a Samaritan, or it's someone you just don't deem worthy to run with, how about giving them a break? I don't know about you, but sometimes I need a break. Sometimes I don't put my best foot forward. How about you? Sometimes I'm not the person I ought to be. Does that ever happen to you? Can we not choose to just give people a break and not judge them before we know them? No matter who they are? Can we not do that? Is that not something we, of all people on the planet, followers of Christ, can find a way to do it? Jesus sat down on a well and talked to a woman that he wasn't supposed to even be around. I think there's a message for us all in this. I think we all need to find a way to be the good Samaritan for the people around us. Amen? I think that's the call on our lives. That's who we're supposed to be. Not the one that points the finger, but the one that helps the man up. Amen. So if you want to become that person, the invitation's always open. If you need to rededicate your life, or if you need to obey the gospel tonight, repenting of your sins, confessing the name of Christ, become a true follower of Jesus, one that looks past some of the things you've looked at and look at the real person. Won't you come if you need to while we stand and while we sing?